Good evening, everybody, and welcome to our In Conversation series from the Royal Society of Medicine. We're very lucky tonight to have somebody who is so famous they don't really need an introduction, but I thought I'd give you an introduction anyway. So Lord Mervyn King was born in Chesham Bois, spelt B-O-I-S, Bois, but pronounced Bois, in Buckinghamshire. And he attended Wolverhampton Grammar School, studied economics at King's College, Cambridge, got a first there, then St John's College, Cambridge, and Harvard University. He worked as a researcher for the Cambridge Growth Project, taught at the University of Birmingham, Harvard, and MIT, and became a professor of economics. He joined the Bank of England in 1990 as a non-executive director, became the chief economist in 1991, and in 1998 became the deputy governor of the bank and a member of the Group of 30. He was appointed governor of the bank in 2003, succeeding Edward George, and notably he oversaw the bank during the financial crisis, which everybody remembers, of 2007, 2008, and the Great Recession that followed it. He retired in 2013 and was succeeded by Mark Carney, who's given the Wreath Lecture this morning. I was listening to that, and appointed a life peer, entering the House of Lords in 2013. So Mervyn, you're very welcome, and thank you so much for joining us. I think we have about 1,000 people ready to listen to your story, which I thought we'd cover the economics of COVID. I thought we'd talk a little bit about the banking crisis and what led up to the banking crisis. But I thought to start off with, just tell us a little bit about your background and being born in Chesham Bois and Chalfont St Peter, I think you were saying, and then Wolverhampton. So Mervyn, you're very welcome.
Well, good evening, Roger, and good evening, everyone. Yes, so I was born in Chesham Bois, which is about 20 miles northwest of London. I didn't live there for very long, but we lived in Little Chalfont, and my father was a school teacher. At the end of the Second World War, there was a program to train demobbed soldiers as teachers, and he took part in that and started as a primary school teacher, then moved to secondary teaching when we moved to Yorkshire, and we lived there for 3 years. And then he became a headmaster, and we moved to the West Midlands. And I lived and grew up really in Wolverhampton, and then to Cambridge to study. So that's the background, really.
You were mentioning that when you were at school at Wolverhampton, quite a famous school, Wolverhampton Grammar School, isn't it?
Yes, it is.
Produced some very good students from there. That you got called into the Royal Hospital in Wolverhampton, where I used to work as a junior registrar in surgery. Tell us a little bit about that.
So at that school, every Thursday, this was Combined Cadet Force Day, and we had to wear our uniforms and boots to take the bus to school in the morning, and we'd take lessons in the morning, and in the afternoon was the Cadet Force afternoon. And I did that for a couple of years. And then we had the option to do other things. So I had training in civil defense, and I was trained as a fireman. But the first thing we were asked to do was every Thursday to go to the local hospital, and we tramped through it with boots on, disturbing the patients. And then we had to go to the basement to help sort out the records of patients. And these were basically lying around loose in the basement of the hospital. And you could pick one up and you'd see it was Mrs. So-and-so of a certain address. You had to try and put them all together and sort them out. But I couldn't imagine that anyone could usefully have employed these records or found them when they needed them. I'm sure with the switch to digital records, it's all very much easier, but it was a bit of a shock to see that.
I think
that was the bad old days of the 60s.
Well, they've knocked that hospital down now, and they've moved to New Cross, a more modern hospital. So tell us then, any stories from Cambridge, because you were at both at King's as an undergraduate and then St John's as a postgraduate, is that right?
No, I was at King's as an undergraduate and postgraduate, and then I went to Harvard for graduate work and came back as a teaching fellow at St John's.
Yeah.
And I suppose what was very striking about Cambridge economics in those days was that it had become highly political. It had really lost touch with how the subject was evolving and developing. And there were big schisms within the economics faculty. And people would knock on your door and they'd be much more likely to say, which way are you going to vote in the faculty meeting, than they would be to ask you a question about economics or your own research. So I then left Cambridge and went to my first chair at Birmingham. And I did that when I was 28 and then stayed there for 6 years, time then in the US, and then back to the London School of Economics.
So you decided to be an academic, really,
Yes,
when you were at Cambridge, yeah.
absolutely.
Yeah.
I never imagined that I would ever be inside the Bank of England, let alone, work there.
Yeah. So I thought we'd start off with the financial issues surrounding COVID, because our Chancellor of the Exchequer seems to be borrowing billions and billions, more than 200 billion, and then distributing this to around the country with great largesse. But I mean, do you think that the sums being borrowed now, which are pretty mind-boggling, I mean, what are the longer-term implications of these massive borrowing that's going on right now?
The media coverage of the statement that Rishi Sunak made last week, where it talked about eye-watering numbers, and in one sense they are, but they weren't really discussed in terms of the context in which we see it. So I don't like the word austerity, because the meaning of it depends entirely on the circumstances in which we find ourselves. So the situation is totally different today than it was 10 years ago in 2010. Then we had the biggest budget deficit of the G20. We were having to borrow money at the same interest rate as Italy. And we just had a large depreciation of sterling, which provided some support to the economy through higher exports, lower imports, which would offset some of the consequences of the fiscal consolidation that was put in place. Now, the situation today is different in all three respects. There has been no significant depreciation of sterling, so there's no boost to demand to offset anything that might happen in terms of higher taxes and lower spending. We entered this situation with a very low budget deficit. So pre-COVID, budget deficit, certainly excluding interest payments, was pretty close to zero. And third, and most important of all, the interest rate at which our government can now borrow and could lock into for many years to come is actually negative, allowing for inflation. The consequence of that is that if we try and put ourselves into the position after COVID-19, if it were the case that the level of public spending after COVID-19 has disappeared was basically the same as it was pre-COVID-19, that is, the temporary schemes have disappeared, then actually there won't really be a need for any significant tax rises or spending cuts in order to be in a position where the much bigger national debt that we will have inherited from COVID-19, but that debt relative to our national income will start slowly but steadily to fall, which is the right way to judge a sustainable fiscal policy, that in normal times, when you're not facing a crisis, be it a war or a pandemic, you would like the ratio of national debt to national income slowly to be drifting down over time. And that will happen because of the very low rate at which governments can borrow and the fact that we start with a very low budget deficit. Now, of course, it is very likely in practice that the government will choose to spend more in, say, 2022-23 than it would have been planning to spend in those years in 2019. But the reason then for any tax increases would not be to repay the large amount of debt that's been incurred. It would instead be to pay for the additional public spending. And that doesn't suggest, if we're sensible, that this will lead to the need for some terrible set of actions on taxes and spending to restore the public finances. So I think that people have really got the argument completely the wrong way around. What we should be worried about is not the increase in national debt, which was a most unfortunate but inevitable consequence of measures to deal with COVID-19. What we might be more worried about is the fact that people are still arguing for monetary and fiscal stimulus this year, when it seems very odd for the government to want to, for good health reasons, push down economic activity with one hand. It doesn't want people to spend on certain things. It doesn't want people to go to work. But then on the other hand, it doesn't make sense to have another branch of government, Bank of England, or even the Treasury, trying to push activity up this year. The time for worrying about that will be further down the road. What is crucial at present is that government supports businesses and incomes of those people who are not able to work or to run businesses because the activities are being closed down. It's vital that we do that. Otherwise, we will lose viable businesses for the future. It will damage the ability of the economy to produce. So what's needed isn't sort of conventional monetary expansion. What's needed is support from the government for businesses. The furlough scheme was a very good scheme. And I think the mistake that was made was to say it will end at the end of October. What it should have said was the furlough scheme will remain in place until we feel that we have managed to suppress the virus and got on top of COVID-19. And then we can start to go back to normal. But until we got to that point, it didn't make sense to plan to remove the support that would be necessary as long as the disease was prevalent.
Well, that's a good answer, a predictably good answer. I've got a couple of questions. You know, we like people to, mainly medics who are listening in, but not exclusively. Peter Hart says, you mentioned the word austerity, that you said you didn't like that word, but what in your view was George Osborne's austerity agenda? It seemed a backwards policy. Was it more of a political stance? And are we going to be looking at more austerity over the next 5 or 10 years as a result of all the borrowing, do you think?
There were two components to the decisions that were taken in 2010. One was an economic judgment that it was appropriate to start to introduce fiscal consolidation, given how big the depreciation of sterling had been. I think it was a sensible economic judgment. The other, because there are a lot of elements to the tax and benefit system which build in what are called in the jargon automatic stabilizers. So if the economy doesn't grow as rapidly as you might have expected, then taxes automatically go down and government spending in the form of unemployment benefit automatically goes up. So that reduces the extent of austerity in that sense automatically. The second component of the decision, though, was that the way in which the fiscal consolidation was carried out could be either tax increases or spending cuts. And that's a political decision, and I didn't get involved in that. And obviously some people who use the word austerity are referring to the political judgment that George Osborne made that there was scope for significant public spending cuts, both on welfare benefits and on payments to local authorities, rather than tax increases. And that's something that people can debate and disagree on, but that's a political judgment. And I understand why people dislike what happened, dislike the way in which the fiscal consolidation was put in place. But I would suggest to them that the underlying economic strategy wasn't at fault, but it's just that you disagree with the political priorities that were shown. Now, what will happen in the future? It seems to me we really do not know today how much the effect of COVID-19 will damage the ability of the economy to produce in the future. It's not obvious to me that it should. Most of the things that are happening are temporary. They're associated with the existence of the disease. And if we can get on top of it, and we can have a program of mass vaccination, and the number of cases dwindles to a small number, then we can return to normal, lift the restrictions. And if that's the case, then I don't see the need for any kind of austerity in that sense at all.
Well, there's another question from Ash Shetty, which I think is relevant too. He says, with currency being printed like toilet paper, won't there be significant inflation over the next few years? I mean, are we looking to an inflationary future? I mean, inflation's been dead for ages, but is it going to rear its ugly head, Mervyn?
Well, inflation never dies. It may go into a coma for a period, but it can always come back. And I think this is a good question. And again, it's unclear what the answer will be. I think that there should be some concern that the extent of so-called quantitative easing, that is where the Bank of England buys government bonds, and in so doing creates money by putting additional money into the bank accounts of the people or institutions who sold their government bond holdings to the Bank of England. It increases the amount of money in the economy. It doesn't do anything in itself to increase the ability of the economy to produce more. And as I said, it seems odd to me that this is the moment to print more money when actually the government is saying to us, in effect, though not in these words, that we're going to have to accept a sharp contraction of the economy as part of the price of dealing with the disease. And once that is over, the Bank of England will either need to withdraw the additional money that it's created, or there is a risk of an overhang of extra money that could down the road lead to higher inflation. Now, the Bank of England has a very clear mandate, which is to keep inflation low and stable. And if it follows that mandate, then if there are signs of inflation rising, I think it will raise interest rates to head that off. But I think the big risk to inflation in the future, and this is something which is impossible to know whether it will happen or not, is if governments in the future are less respectful of the independence of the Bank of England and either put direct pressure, change the mandate, or indirect pressure on the individuals working at the Bank of England to go along with a program of printing more money to buy and finance government debt, then finance the deficits and buy government debt, then that is the path down which it is conceivable that the ability of the Bank of England to resist pressure from the government to take the unpleasant measures that would be needed to head off higher inflation, that path could lead to higher inflation in the future. But I think the vehicle by it wouldn't just be the decisions taken this year to print more money. It would be whether those are continued once the restrictions have been lifted, and whether the Bank of England can retain its effective independence to decide what happens to interest rates and how much money to print.
There are loads of questions coming in. We've got 13 now. Richard York is asking about interest rates. They're all using this opportunity to grill you about the future, Mervyn. Maybe they think they're going to, you'll help them with investment advice as well. Richard York says, if there's a rapid economic recovery next year, will the Bank of England raise interest rates, or will they leave them low and allow inflation to reduce the debt? And I guess that leads on to, people have been talking about negative interest rates where you actually have to pay the bank to keep your money. So what are your thoughts about interest rates in the future?
Well, I don't know where interest rates will go. I'm no longer at the Bank of England, and only the members of the Monetary Policy Committee can decide where interest rates will go. So I'm not going to second guess what they will do. The question of negative interest rates has come up. My own view is that it's unlikely that we'll see that in the Anglo-Saxon world, because there are other things that those central banks could do, like more QE, printing money if they need to do it. And the idea that they may be able to reduce interest rates to a level at which banks pay a small negative interest rate on their reserves with the Bank of England. But I can't imagine that they would ever get to the point where the banks would be forced to charge negative interest rates on our bank deposits, because the risk of that is partly that individuals would say, what are these people doing? Have they taken leave of their senses? It would damage confidence in the framework. And second, there would be an incentive to go along to your bank and ask for cash, to ask for banknotes to be given to you out of your account, take them home, put them under the mattress, or preferably somewhere more secure in a home safe, where there is a zero interest rate. So I don't think that's a path down which anyone really wants to go. And I think it's only been adopted in countries like the European Central Bank, like Japan, where there's been a sense of desperation. God, we've got to do something. What can we think of doing? And I think the big challenge to central banks today is actually to ask themselves, what's really going on here? And we've been through a decade in which we've seen probably the biggest monetary stimulus the world has ever seen. And we just had slow growth. So the idea that the only thing that was wrong in the last decade was that we didn't have enough monetary stimulus, I find implausible. And there are other challenges and problems which explain why the world economy has been growing slowly and ours with it.
Now, I know that what's really going on here is one of your favourite expressions, Mervyn. I read it in your book. I'll see if I can bring this up on my computer, and I don't know whether you can see that book, Radical Uncertainty. I've been reading it today. Fantastic book. But just tell us a little bit about that. All the concepts in there, Mervyn, of uncertainty and the known unknowns and the unknown unknowns that you talk about in that book. I think it's a really interesting there's loads of interesting ideas. Just talk a little bit about that.
About 100 years ago, in fact, next year it will be exactly 100 years, two very famous economists, John Maynard Keynes in this country and Frank Knight in Chicago, wrote books which talked about the nature of uncertainty and the difficulty of expressing that in terms of probabilities. And there are many kinds of uncertainties where it simply doesn't make sense to try and pretend that you can talk about the probability that something would happen. And we should be content with we should be confident enough to be able to use sentences like, it is likely that there will be a pandemic in the future at some point, and therefore we should prepare for it. But I mean, we actually wrote in the book last summer when we sent it to the publisher that we should expect to be hit by an epidemic of an infectious disease resulting from a virus that does not yet exist. Well, that was well known because we knew pandemics existed, but it wouldn't have made any sense for someone to say, you know, I think the probability that a virus will come out of Wuhan in China in December is 27% or any other number. So there are uncertainties about which we know something, but not enough. And the challenge is to make decisions in that sort of world. So I think that one of the mistakes that's been made, I mean, I have great sympathy for the politicians having to make decisions about how to deal with the disease that we're confronting now. One of the mistakes which I think has been made has been this pretense of certainty, this argument that, well, we're doing what the science tells us to do, and the scientists are very clear what has to be done. Well, that's silly because in a situation of dealing with a pandemic, there's plenty of room for debate about what you need to do when you start from a point where you have a virus that you haven't seen before and you don't know things like the mortality rate of the virus. So the models that were used, the epidemiological models, should have been used to assess the sensitivity of the progress of the disease to certain key parameters or assumptions about what would happen. Instead, either some of the modelers themselves or governments using the models allowed the numbers to be presented as a forecast. And this was, I think, a terrible mistake, because if you don't know the mortality rate of a virus, and you don't know key parameters, and you certainly don't know how individuals and families are going to respond to particular measures that may be imposed on them, or how they respond when the measures are relaxed, you cannot make a forecast. And I've been surprised to see that the failures of epidemiological forecasts are exactly the same as the failure of economic forecasts. People are so desperate to have these numbers, but they don't make any sense. What does make sense is to use the models to say questions like, well, if the mortality rate was, or if take something more sophisticated, if the length of time between infection and when you start to display symptoms is X days rather than X plus 2 days, does this make a difference to the progress of the disease? And get some feel for what are the kind of things that we should try to learn about. This is the value of models. It's what I learned from people like Bob May and Roy Anderson, who wrote the classic textbook on a lot of this and developed models, particularly at Imperial. And they were always very careful. I spent some time talking to them about precisely these issues, what the economic effects would be when I was governor of the bank. And what they were very careful to do was not to pretend that they can make a forecast, but always to ask the question, what is going on here? In order to get a feel for what are the factors that are likely to drive what was going on. And how can you find information that will be helpful in assessing how a virus might spread, how the disease might spread. And I think that this, what we've seen, both in the economic sphere, with people desperate to have forecasts about what's going to happen to the economy next year or the year after, and in terms of forecasting the path of the epidemic, is what I call bogus quantification. It's saying that it's pretending that you know more than you do. And if you don't know certain key parameters, it's better to rely on sensitivity analysis, to be honest about it. So the politicians should have said at the beginning, you know, we don't know enough about this virus to pretend we know where it will go. It's bound to be a process of trial and error. And we're all confronting this. And that would make it much easier, I think, to explain why changes of course, changes in regulations are appropriate. But if you pretend that you know this is the right thing to do, and the politicians have always been abdicating responsibility and pushing it onto the scientists, then I think that you get into serious trouble. And equally, the scientists shouldn't pretend that they can forecast how individuals and households are likely to respond, because they don't know. And I think it takes genuine intellectual self-confidence to be able to say in answer to a question, I don't know. And that's the test, I think, of whether things are done well. And I think I was very impressed at the beginning of this episode when the press conferences started, and Chris Whitty would attend the press conferences. And I remember that one tabloid journalist asked him the question, so how many people are going to die? And Chris Whitty said, I don't know. And that was a tremendous start. But the political pressure on them subsequently has led them down the path to allow so that they end up with numbers to try and justify government decisions, which are political decisions. And it's very unfortunate that that's been turned into a forecast, which is attached to which is the label science. And then this justifies what politicians choose to do.
Yeah. Chris Whitty's, I think, had a pretty good COVID. I feel terribly sorry for him, because he's not a person that likes to be in the front line in the media, but he's had to do it almost. Yeah. But he's a great chap and a great doctor, as we were hearing. Let's go back in time a little bit, because I mentioned to you, Mervyn, we had Norman Lamont on as a guest a few months ago, and we got to the point where he was, I can't remember if he was whistling in the bath or singing in the shower. I think it might have been the latter, but maybe it was the former. But, that was Black Wednesday, and things looked absolutely dire then. And I think that what I would like to hear, and I hope what our audience would like to hear, is your sort of review of from that time up to 2008 and the financial crisis. Just give us your view of the things that starting then that actually led to the financial crisis, and of course it comes back to your idea of forecasting and some of the things that could have been known or should have been known, or maybe it wasn't possible to know what was happening. But just give us a bit of economic history.
So 1992 in many ways was a crucial turning point. It was a shattering defeat for government policy. They had, after 10 years of struggling very hard to bring inflation down, succeeding at first, then it went back up again. And the battle to join the exchange rate mechanism was one that pitched people like Geoffrey Howe and Nigel Lawson on the one hand against Margaret Thatcher on the other. And there was stalemate for a while. And then eventually, Margaret Thatcher was persuaded to join when John Major was Chancellor. Now, the unfortunate thing was that the time we chose to join turned out to be the point of German unification, when Germany needed to have very high interest rates to contain the extra spending and investment that was going on following German reunification. And the whole point of the exchange rate mechanism was that everyone else would peg their currency to the Deutschmark, in order to inherit or acquire the credibility and reputation of the Bundesbank to control inflation. But it turned out that it would have been much better if the Germans had themselves temporarily left the exchange rate mechanism until things had settled down in Germany. But that meant that every other country was having to have much higher interest rates than really was ideal for them. That was particularly the case for the UK and Italy. So in the end, it was, I think, inevitable that speculation would drive us out of the exchange rate mechanism. And then we had to put in a new domestic policy framework, which was inflation targeting, which was then extremely successful for the next 15 years or so. And that was a big step forward. And the next stage in this process was that after 5 years of success with this framework and a new Labour government coming in that wanted to cement its credibility for economic common sense and stability, decided to make the Bank of England independent. Margaret Thatcher had refused to do that on the grounds that it was a great election winner for her to say you can't trust Labour with the economy. But having gained power, the way to overcome that proposition was for the Labour Party to make the Bank of England independent, and that's exactly what they did. And then that also proved successful. But at the same time, there were major problems in the world economy. And these were associated in large part with the entry of China into the world economy, what happened in those countries that had formed part of the Soviet Union. Essentially, the part of the world that was making manufactured goods, trading with each other, basically doubled almost overnight. And that led to very big differences, with some countries saving a lot and other countries saving a little. And in Britain, we had an unbalanced economy. We had an economy that was growing rapidly because of domestic consumption spending, but we had a big trade deficit and exports were not contributing to balance the economy. So the question is what to do about it. And we had quite big debates on this at the Monetary Policy Committee, where one argument was we really ought to try and slow the economy, try and shock the foreign exchange market into pushing sterling down, so that the impetus to demand from stronger exports could be then allowed to offset a reduction in consumer spending that would come about through higher interest rates. I think Eddie George realized that the difficulty with this was that the Bank of England had only just acquired independence. And if there had been a downturn, even if it was relatively shallow or short-lived, that would be seen as a mistake by this newly independent central bank, and it would undermine the credibility of the Bank of England, and we couldn't afford to do it. So he coined the phrase, two-speed growth is better than no growth. So we had two speeds, consumer spending and then exports. And what this meant was that interest rates were probably lower than would have been ideal to have a balanced economy, and the exchange rate was too high. But that's what we had. And around the world, what we were seeing was that interest rates were just coming down and down. It started with China having so much savings that they were investing it into the world capital market. That was pushing down long-term interest rates. And most Western countries decided they want to maintain growth rather than go for slow growth for a period and then get more balanced growth. So they cut interest rates. And if you cut interest rates, clearly people want to borrow more. And the banking system did what it was supposed to do, which was to meet the higher demand for borrowing at the interest rate set by central banks. The problem was, what many of the banks did was to finance themselves by borrowing rather than issuing new equity. And the difficulty of that was, and it really, I think these complex financial instruments that everyone talks about are actually only a small part of the story. The big part of the story is that banks became more and more fragile and less resilient, so that when there was a shock, which happened in 2007, when a French bank announced that it wasn't able to allow people to redeem some of their investments linked to American mortgages, then people started to wonder, well, maybe other banks are in the same position. And none of these banks seem to have a large amount of equity to absorb losses. So if there are any significant losses, we don't know which banks are going to suffer the losses. So a sensible thing is just to stop lending to any bank for the time being. And that's what generated the crisis. We then went through a period of 12 months in which the confidence in the banking system as a whole waxed and waned. And it ultimately collapsed with the failure of Lehman Brothers in September 2008. But I think that it's a mistake to think of this as a problem generated by either particular sets of securities or particular banks. The system as a whole failed. And indeed, my opposite number in the Federal Reserve, Ben Bernanke, said, if it hadn't been for the support which the Federal Reserve and the US Treasury gave, every major financial institution in the US would have failed. So I think that's how it came about. And of course, the big lesson, which is also the lesson from COVID-19, is that resilience matters. Having a lean and efficient, profitable financial system is of no value if when some unpleasant event occurs, they're too fragile to survive.
And then when did you and the bank and Gordon Brown and Alistair Darling and the Treasury realize that the sort of full scale of the catastrophe? Was it because Northern Rock went down first and then Lehman Brothers was the really big shock, wasn't it? But I mean, at some stage, it must have dawned on you that this was a horrific recession, financial crisis.
So for most of 2008, I was very clear that the banking system had to be recapitalized. In other words, you had to issue more equity in order that it was capable of absorbing losses. So we had lots of debates about this, and the UK was in fact the first country to take steps to recapitalize its banking system, followed shortly thereafter by the United States. But I think the difficulty in getting action early enough was that the degree of confidence in the banking system did fluctuate a lot from month to month. And every now and then people said, oh, it's okay, we're over the worst. All we have to do is just lend more to the banks. But actually that wasn't the answer and never was. The answer had to be that the banks needed to be recapitalized in order to persuade people in the private sector that it was then safe to lend to banks. And of course, it's interesting that when the big steps to recapitalize the American banking system were announced in May 2009, the banking system ended almost immediately. The banking crisis came to an end immediately. The economic crisis didn't, but the banking crisis did.
And in your book, The End of Alchemy, I mean, you mentioned the issue of moral hazard, that the banks, as you said, were undercapitalized and probably lending too much, especially in the subprime mortgage market, et cetera, with these derivatives. But here they were making all those mistakes, and yet the government and the Bank of England bailed them out with taxpayers' money. I mean, I know you've been critical of the people in charge of the banks, but tell us a little bit about that idea of moral hazard and the way it's.
Well, if you suddenly find yourselves in the middle of a crisis and the banking system is failing, as the day when the Royal Bank of Scotland telephoned me and said they couldn't get to the end of the day, so I had to metaphorically sign a cheque for over 30 billion pounds. Well, he was collecting his unemployment benefit at that. I mean, the day that they did that was clear he was on his way out.
Right.
But once you're in that crisis and the failure of a big bank like that, which I think would, in those circumstances, would have led to a panic about the other big banks, because people couldn't really say, well, this bank is in deep trouble, but no one else is. That wouldn't have been very, very logical. To allow the entire banking system to fail would have created enormous damage to the economy as a whole. So what I used to say to the Treasury Committee was, we are trying to save the banking system in order to protect the economy. We're not trying to save the banks for their own right, but we're doing it to help the economy as a whole. Now, if you're in that position, that's what you have to do. But of course, the big question is, you don't want to start from here. You actually want to make sure that you have a regulatory system that makes it much less likely that banks will end up in that situation. And if you don't do very much on that front, and simply wait until there's a crisis and then rush in and throw money at the problem, then the next crisis will be even bigger, because people will know that they can afford to take risks, because if it goes wrong for the system as a whole, they'll all get bailed out.
Yeah.
So, and that is the risk of stepping in at every juncture in order to prop up financial markets and the banking system. So in the book that you mentioned, End of Alchemy, I did propose a scheme under which we would make the commercial banks pre-position collateral with the Bank of England, so that the bank would be confident that they knew it was sensible to lend money against this collateral to ward off threats of the collapse of a bank. And that in turn would limit the amount that banks could finance themselves from short-term borrowing relative to the risky investments that they might make. And that it's a kind of tax on the risky activities of the banking system. And I think that'd be a much better way to do it.
Well, there are a few more, about 37 questions now, and quite a few of them are on Brexit. Jonathan Kwok, Robert Johnson, Thomas Ward, all asking questions about Brexit. Let me choose one of them. Jonathan says, given the imminence of a Brexit deal or no deal, and literally within a few days, this is going to be decided, hopefully, what factors would increase your comfort that the UK economy should be able to quickly rebound post-Brexit? Is no deal a problem or not really? I believe you're a Brexiteer, a bit like Norman Lamont. So what are your thoughts about where we are now and what's going to happen in the future?
So I don't like to associate myself with people who call themselves Brexiteers, because I think this is primarily a political issue rather than an economic one.
Right.
I always felt, and said so immediately after the referendum campaign, that there were only two options that really made sense. One was to, if you really believe that we'd all made a mistake, would be to start preparing to leave, but give people the option of a second referendum. I think that would have been very difficult, to be honest, but it's possible that if you demonstrated that you were deadly serious about ensuring that we could leave and were doing your best to achieve that, then you wouldn't get the angst that occurred when people started to speculate about a second referendum. Anyway, we didn't go down that path. And then the only other alternative that I thought made sense was to say that we have to prepare to leave without a deal. We would like to have a free trade deal. We're prepared to discuss and negotiate that. But the EU needed to understand that the only sensible thing for us was to prepare for no deal, because without that, we had no negotiating position at all. We had no bargaining power. And I think that was undermined fatally by the government spending no money on no deal preparations for a very long period. Well, we are where we are now. I do not know whether we are prepared for no deal in terms of the short run potential dislocation at borders. Only those in the know will really know that. I think there is bound to be, given how late the timetable is for the negotiations, some kind of dislocation. It obviously has increased the pressure enormously on both sides to reach a deal. And indeed, I think the best way to think about this is to say, think of this as you're trying to trade something, a car, a seller of a car and a buyer. And the seller is saying, I want £2,000, and the buyer is saying, I'll only be willing to pay £1,000. But it's probably true in this case that the buyer would pay £2,000 and the seller would accept £1,000. So there's plenty of scope for a deal. However, both sides may know that, and therefore you get stuck with both sides holding back to the last possible minute in order, hoping that the other side will give in. And it's quite possible that in the next week, what we see is negotiations break down and then start again 24 hours later, break down again, start again, who knows? But the thing we should hang on to, which is comforting, I think, is the following. If there are dislocations after the 1st of January, at that point, there will be no further negotiations. And both sides, therefore, will have a very strong incentive to take action to minimize the length and impact of those dislocations. It doesn't do the northern France any good at all to have long queues at borders, which disrupt trade because people may switch their convoys to other ports in other countries in Europe. But the most important thing, I think, is that looking at it dispassionately, I find it hard to see why the long-run economic consequences will actually be very significant. There will be some impact on particular sectors. Fishing is well known, but it's a tiny part of our economy. Agriculture is another, where the UK will have, I think, freedom to change the way in which we subsidize agriculture for the better, I hope. It may be we can get cheaper food. That will all depend on our government's responses. And the motor car industry would face a tariff of, say, 10%. But since we import far more cars than we export to the EU, then actually that's a real problem for the EU. But the average tariff that would be imposed if we leave without a deal and trade with what are called WTO, World Trade Organization rules, is very small. It's about 3%. Well, the exchange rate can move by that in a week, and that will offset any impact of the tariffs. When we joined the common market, as it then was in the early 70s, I don't believe that transformed the British economy. The big changes to the British economy were those that took place in the late 70s and 80s in terms of changing macroeconomic policy and introducing far more competition and deregulation of nationalized, privatized industries. So I don't think that if joining it didn't transform our economy, it's not obvious to me that leaving it will. And the arguments that we used in the campaign on both sides were examples of what I call bogus quantification. So when George Osborne said, you know, the Treasury have worked very hard at this, economists in the bank and the Treasury have studied, and they have now concluded that we'll all be £4,300 worse off, or each family will be £4,300 worse off if we vote for Brexit. I think people could say, well, how on earth do they know that? And the answer was they couldn't. There was enormous uncertainty about it. You can debate that. And I think there are certainly, it's possible to debate about whether it's good or bad to leave the EU. But I think the arguments that are more compelling are the political ones, because on the economic side, frankly, we don't know very much at all. And my instinct is that once we've got over the short run consequences, that in the long run, the economic consequences of leaving the EU will neither be the sort of economic disaster that many Remainers want to believe in, nor will it be an economic paradise, which many of the leavers want to believe in. Probably won't add up to a great deal.
The sunlit uplands or the deep doom. And you make a good point, radical uncertainty again. Actually, your pal, Sir Marcus Setchell, who we had on this program 3 weeks ago now, has beamed in a question. He says you're a lifelong sports enthusiast. I think you play with him at the All England Lawn Tennis Club, which is actually down the road from where I live. Marcus says, do you think the regulations imposed on sport were appropriate during the COVID crisis on either health or economic grounds?
Again, I just don't know what would have been a sensible set of regulations. I think with the benefit of hindsight, it was a mistake not to. It was a mistake to close schools. We should have allowed that to go on. In terms of sports grounds, the real problem is less the stadium itself. You could limit the number of people in, and I think one of the sad things about what's happened in the UK is that many organisations, from shops to football clubs, did try very hard and spend money on working out how it would be possible for them to impose social distancing on their shops or stadia. I think the reason why they have not gone further in terms of allowing bigger crowds in stadia is to do with congregation of people going to the stadium and leaving from it, and whether that imposes a risk of infection through public transport or not. Though with those small numbers that are currently being allowed, it's hard. I mean, most of them will travel by car. They won't have that much trouble finding parking spaces if you've only got 2,000 people in the stadium rather than 50,000. But, you know, one of the problems with it is that if you have tiers 1, 2, and 3, and football clubs, for example, in tier 3 are not allowed to have any spectators, football clubs that through no good work on their own part happen to be in tier 1 or 2 can have 2,000 people there, and or 4,000 in tier 1. And I think, you know, this, if having spectators back in grounds seems to make a difference, the clubs that happen to be in tier 3 areas will have a very good ground for complaint that this is no longer a level playing field. Yeah. This illustrates the sheer difficulty, I think, of knowing how to convert a generalized strategy for suppressing the virus into detailed regulations. It's not easy, and I think it's impossible to justify it in any way other than it's arbitrary. But unless we do something, we are very worried that the virus will spread. Now, I think you can do some things which are more sensible than others, and I do think that many shops have paid a price for having converted their work, their premises to places which were COVID compliant, and then suddenly told they have to shut completely. That doesn't make a lot of sense.
Let me ask you a question. Where do you prefer to be, at the All England Tennis Club and that wonderful club there where I sometimes see Marcus, or in the House of Lords? Where?
Well, I mean, obviously we're not allowed to go to the House of Lords, or for that matter, the All England Club.
Pre-COVID.
When I was young, I'll tell you what I used to dream. I knew exactly what my career would be. My career would be one in which I would spend the winter months playing football at inside left for Aston Villa.
All right.
Over the summer, I would captain Worcestershire County Cricket Club to the championship, apart from 2 weeks in the middle when I would take 2 weeks off to defend my singles title at Wimbledon. But the pleasure of playing at the All England Club on grass courts in the surroundings of the All England Club is actually unbeatable. It really is a wonderful experience, and I feel very privileged to be able to do it.
And they have a lovely restaurant there with very good, well-priced bottles of wine. I noticed when I
I'm
went.
surprised, Roger, that you take wine either before or just after playing an exhilarating game of tennis.
Definitely after, when I'm playing with Marcus. There's a question about cryptocurrencies. We've got maybe a couple of minutes. That's a weird situation, isn't it? The way the cryptocurrencies are behaving. Any last thoughts about that for one of our? Can't remember now who asked that question.
Well, I'm not allowed to give investment advice, but I can tell you I don't buy cryptocurrencies. It's a speculative investment. And I think the difficulty is, although it's easier now to make payments through Bitcoin, for example, I could transfer Bitcoins to you, Roger, if you had a Bitcoin account. But why do we want to pass Bitcoins to each other? What I want to do is to buy stuff out there. And it's actually much more difficult to get the Bitcoins out to buy goods and services. It's improving, but when you do it, then the anonymity of using a Bitcoin transaction then disappears. So I don't think the fact of Bitcoin is going to transform the way we make payments electronically, but I do think that the way we make payments will go almost wholly digital. It's gone a very long way. And most financial institutions and organizations like Apple and others are exploring ways of making it easy to do transactions, because at present, it is rather expensive. The amount of money which is made by the organizations that make payments arrangements through banks and credit cards is very large. And you know, there's scope for new entry to compete that away. So we need cheaper ways of making transactions electronically, but I'm not sure that Bitcoin is the way to go.
One last question, and maybe this is naive because I'm not really an expert on this at all. But if money is all digital, and when the bank, say in inverted commas, prints more money to allow more money into the system, I mean, it's basically just changing the numbers on a computer, aren't you? I mean,
Well, you're crediting people's bank accounts actually, and it's bank accounts. Most money that's relevant to the activity in the economy comprises bank accounts.
Yeah.
A small part of it are the reserves that commercial banks have with the Bank of England. But when the Bank of England creates money electronically, it buys government bonds, for example, from people who come to an auction for those bonds, and it gives a check written on the Bank of England to those people who take it to their commercial bank, deposit it in their bank account, and that increases the bank deposits of those individuals. And the commercial bank takes it to the Bank of England, which is then credited to the bank account or reserve of the commercial banks. And that's how money gets created. That's how the Bank of England does it.
I wanted to ask you about the old lady of Threadneedle Street, but we haven't got much time. But did you enjoy your time there?
Yeah, it's a wonderful institution. I remember being very surprised at the beginning, having come from academic life. Lots of people would do things that were clearly in the interest of the bank as a whole, even if they weren't in their own individual interest. And that sort of collective commitment was not something I'd seen in academic life. And it's a wonderful institution, and the loyalty of the staff at the Bank of England is the bank's biggest asset. And I work very hard to try and retain that. And I think it's very important. A lot of people would come to the bank and say, oh, these old fuddy-duddy traditions. What they never convinced anyone of was that, of course, in terms of policy and our operations in financial markets, we were a thoroughly modern bank. We were at the frontiers of most of these things. But it was sensible to keep those traditions that the staff had grown up with and enjoyed and valued, because it was part of their identity with the bank. And you should not play around with that, because if you do that, you'll damage the commitment of the staff and their loyalty to the bank, which was our biggest asset. But it's a great institution. I've thoroughly enjoyed my time there.
Well, you've had just a fantastic career, and I definitely would recommend that people should go out and buy a copy of Radical Uncertainty. Being a surgeon myself, I know how uncertain some aspects of medicine are. And although patients are always saying, how long have I got, doc? And I think I say this is radically uncertain. I can't tell you. So thank you. So don't go away, Mervyn, but thank you so much for this. I would mention that this is being recorded. It goes on YouTube, and we find on average, about 10 times more people watch it on YouTube than they do live. So it should get a good airing. Just to mention a few things, that this is the day for vaccines, and actually just by chance, we on Thursday at 12:30, I'm interviewing Maheshi Ramasamy from Oxford. He's been involved, one of the key members of the Oxford team developing the AstraZeneca vaccine. So we'll be talking all aspects of vaccine, including the Pfizer vaccine, the Moderna vaccine, and the AstraZeneca one. And on the same day, Jane McQuitty and David Gleave from Liberty Wine will be having a virtual wine tasting. Maybe we should get you involved in that, Mervyn. And then next week's In Conversation is Dr. Rachel Clark, very famous palliative care doctor from Oxford. And following that, Martha Lane Fox will be talking on In Conversation. So just to mention, our building is reopening next week, number 1 Wimpole Street. We've had a very hard time at the RSM because of COVID, because normally our income is very dependent on that building and the hotel that we have there, and the bar and the restaurant and all the lectures. So if people watching this are feeling generous and would like to support the Royal Society of Medicine and all the work we do with education and innovation in medicine, please do make a donation. This In Conversation series has raised so far £91,150. That's peanuts compared with the billions that Mervyn dished out in 2008. But for us, 91,000 is quite a good sum. So we're hoping to get to 100,000 at the end of this year. So if you could make a generous donation, I would be very grateful. So thank you so much, Mervyn. I love talking to you. I loved hearing about your career at Cambridge, the old lady of Threadneedle Street, and your interesting and exciting times during the various crises that you dealt with so well. So thank you, and good night. Good night to all our viewers and listeners, and do help the RSM in our hour of need. Thank you. Goodbye.
Thank you, Roger. It was my pleasure.